As the military conflict continues to unfold in the east, both the Russian-led militants and the Ukrainian military have been accused of human rights abuses by groups such as Human Rights Watch, one of the world's leading rights organizations. One such report claims that Ukraine has used illegal cluster munitions in civilian-populated areas. I sat down with Kenneth Roth, the executive director of Human Rights Watch, to talk about some of the major issues facing Ukraine and the accusations of abuse leveled at the government. Human Rights Watch in October released a report accusing the Ukrainian military of using cluster munitions in the Donetsk area. Since then, there's been a lot of criticism from the Ukrainian government, as well as monitors from the OSCE and military experts. Do you still stand behind that report?
Oh, 100%. Let me put this in context, if I could. I mean, first of all, Human Rights Watch in any armed conflict looks at both sides. And so we've done extensive work on abuses by the separatists. We've actually issued 23 different publications about abuses by the separatists. We've also issued a whole report on abuses under the Russian occupiers in the Crimea. So we're dealing with that side of things. But at the same time, we're looking at the behavior of government troops. And our concern is the use of indiscriminate weapons in populated areas. And we're principally concerned about the use of grad rockets as well as cluster munitions. And in each of these cases, what we do, we have people, investigators on the ground, and we obviously speak to eyewitnesses, but we never are satisfied simply with eyewitnesses. We've been looking at the physical evidence on the ground. And for something like cluster munitions, the point of impact, it's obvious that they're cluster munitions. They make a very unique display on the ground, if you will. And we then looked to the area where people said they'd been fired from. This was government-controlled areas. And we were actually able to find certain rockets that would have delivered the cluster munitions, but some of them fell short and had actually landed still in government territory. So there is very solid physical evidence demonstrating the government's responsibility.
And one of the criticisms, of course, in this report has been that, of course, Ukraine and Russia are both former Soviet republics, and they share a lot of the same military technology. And so how do weapons investigators, how can they conclusively say whether it's a Russian weapon or a Ukrainian weapon in these sorts of situations?
The weapons often are shared. There's no question about that, which is why you have to look at the direction that the weapon was shot in. And if you take the clusters, for example, or a grad rocket, where it lands in a sense with the trajectory, with an arrow pointing to where it came from. And then you go back and you look in that area to see, is there evidence that it was shot from here? And sometimes you actually find remnants there of rockets that didn't launch completely, or other physical traces to demonstrate that, yes, this weapon was fired from this territory. Then you say, well, who was controlling this territory on that date? That's pretty easy to figure out. Sometimes it's rebel-held areas, but sometimes it's government-held areas. And when it is, that's what we report.
Since this report came out, what has the government response been like? Has there been any movement toward responding to this report?
Well, what we've been doing during my several days here in Kiev is talking with the government about issuing clearer orders to the troops on the ground in the east. Because, the good news is the government doesn't contest the basic requirements of the Geneva Conventions, which is that indiscriminate weapons like grad rockets or cluster munitions should never be used in populated areas. They accept that. So the question is, do the troops on the ground understand that? When we pressed the government, they said, well, we've ordered the troops to follow the Geneva Conventions. We've told the troops to abide by the penal code. That's not good enough. That's too vague.
More amateur video has emerged showing insurgent-controlled areas where grads are being fired from apartment blocks and other civilian-populated areas. What can be done about these sort of tactics that encourage fire from the Ukrainian side?
Well, on the Ukrainian side, they have to always find a way to, if they're going to fire back in a way that pinpoints only the military target and doesn't endanger surrounding civilians. But clearly, Human Rights Watch and others have to condemn the separatists for endangering civilians, which we are doing and will continue to do. It's also, frankly, important for Ukraine to maintain the moral high ground. Because today, because of Russia's role in the East, Ukraine enjoys enormous goodwill around the world. But Ukraine is going to lose that goodwill if it doesn't respect the Geneva Conventions. If Ukraine is seen as fighting in a way that is no better than the separatists, the world's going to wash their hands of the conflict and say, well, we don't know who the good guys are.
Separatists, rebels, insurgents. We have a lot of different terms being thrown around. And is it fair to call them rebels or separatists if we know that there are volunteers coming from abroad and there's overwhelming evidence that Russian forces have been operating inside Ukraine? Can they still be called separatists and rebels?
I don't get hung up on the terminology, to be honest. I mean, we look at whatever the forces are on the ground, we look at how they behave. We don't spend a lot of time asking who they are because, frankly, the Geneva Conventions don't ask who they are. They say who's ever in control of this territory, whoever is an armed force operating there, they got to abide by these rules. And we just go with the Geneva Conventions. So, we use whatever the local terminology is. Here I've heard separatists, I've heard rebels, I've heard insurgents. I don't really care. I just want whoever they are to respect the Geneva Conventions, which isn't happening very often.
And moving away from the Donbass area just for a moment, Human Rights Watch released a report recently about the situation in Crimea. What are some of the main issues that we're facing now in the past several months in Crimea that maybe we're not hearing as much about in the media anymore?
Well, in Crimea, you have a clear situation of Russian occupation. And so that means the Fourth Geneva Convention, which governs belligerent occupation, applies. And it imposes certain duties on the occupying power with respect to the civilian population. And what we're seeing is broadly speaking, two types of problems. On the one hand, critics of the Russian occupation are being persecuted. These are some just regular dissidents, but a lot of them are Crimean Tatars who have their own strong historical reasons not to be thrilled about suddenly being governed by Russia. But second, what we find is that many residents of the Crimea who, until very recently enjoyed citizenship in their own country, suddenly, if they don't want Russian citizenship, which some of them don't, they face the prospect of losing the right of a citizen to reside in their home. And that is deeply problematic.
We have a situation where we have upwards of 1 million people displaced in the past several months from Crimea and from the conflict zone in eastern Ukraine. It's one of the worst humanitarian crises in recent memory here in Europe. What's the response been like here in Ukraine and Europe? How would you rate the response to this crisis?
Well, the problem that we're finding that many internally displaced people are encountering is that in order to obtain basic governmental benefits, whether it's housing or healthcare, requires establishing residency someplace. And if you are kicked out of your home in the East and may not have all your papers with you, it can be difficult as a displaced person to demonstrate the kind of local residency required to gain access to these governmental benefits. So many people then are falling back on the generosity of local charities and the like. But they should be able to depend on the government if that's the route they choose.
And since this is a crisis that's happening on the doorstep of the European Union, does Europe have any responsibility to address this refugee crisis and generally the crisis unfolding for people here in Ukraine?
Well, we certainly encourage generosity by Europeans in many ways. And it's not simply the humanitarian issue. I mean, obviously, Ukraine needs a lot of economic assistance as it tries to, turn the boat around and try to rebuild the economy. And it's doing it, with the threat of, a major war in the East. So these are not easy times in Ukraine. We all recognize that. And I think that, the hearts of many in the West go out to the people of Ukraine. They want to see a successful Ukraine. Part of that is going to require reform. It's going to mean building the rule of law domestically. It's going to mean ending the corruption and the misrule that, frankly, has been somewhat endemic and is part of why Ukraine is in such difficult circumstances today. Everybody wants to see that turned around. That is going to be partly a matter of the West being generous, but it's also going to be a big part, a question of political will here at home. There's a new government in place, just announced. These are the challenges that are before it.
It's just over the weekend, we marked the anniversary of the violent crackdown on protests on Maidan that really galvanized the Euromaidan movement and became sort of a symbol of government oppression here in Ukraine. How has the human rights situation in the rest of the country and the government, has it changed? How has it changed in the past year since the Euromaidan revolution?
Well, there's obviously been a flourishing of civil society since the Maidan demonstrations, the protests, and a real, I think, mobilization of society, which is good. I think the Ukrainian people want to take control of their political lives, and they want a government that is going to be responsive to their concerns. So we've seen now 2 elections. We've seen a government emerge that does seem to have broad support behind it. So in a sense, the ball is in the government's court. It's time for the government to answer the people's demand for accountable, responsible government that builds the rule of law, that ensures that government officials are not above the law but are subject to the law, and that tries to, in a sense, live up to the European goals that lay behind the Maidan protests, but which have been elusive so far, as the Ukrainian people have had to suffer through one government after another that never quite lived up to their hopes. I hope this time it's different.
I'd like to thank you so much for joining me here today in Kiev.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Thanks again.
Sure.